October is Black History Month, and in a year which has seen extraordinary protests around the world under the banner of Black Lives Matter, we have also seen the unequal racial impact of COVID-19 in many parts of the world. And so to kick off our public events programme, where we try to address issues of importance to the world, I can think of no more appropriate conversation than this one between Wendy Williams, who is the person who conducted the independent review on the effect of immigration policy on the Windrush generation, and Dr. Shreya Attry, whose recent book on intersectional discrimination was runner-up for the prestigious Peter Burks Prize. The conversation will cover the question, which is the title of the Windrush Review, Lessons Learned. And in particular, today in this academic institution, we're going to focus on recommendation 6. Now, recommendation 6 of Wendy Williams' review said that in order to avoid the issues that had arisen in relation to the Windrush generation, the Home Office should devise, implement and review a comprehensive learning and development programme which makes sure all its existing new staff learn about the history of the UK and its relationship with the rest of the world, including Britain's colonial history, the history of inward and outward migration, and the history of Black Britons. This programme should be developed in partnership with academic experts in historical migration and should include the findings of this review and its ethnographic research to understand the impact of the department's decisions. And it was also recommended that the Home Office publish an annual return confirming how many staff, managers and senior civil servants had completed the programme. So we want today to talk about what can we learn from the Windrush report and what should we do better to address the racial legacy of empire. And what finally and importantly for us does this mean for academic institutions? This first online public discussion of this academic year is the first public event for both Mansfield College and the Bonavero Institute. It of course takes place in Black History Month, and I am delighted and in fact honoured to invite Wendy Williams and Shreya Attry to speak. Now, Wendy Williams, as well as the author of the report, is also currently Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Her Majesty's Inspector of Fire and Rescue Services, with responsibility for 13 police forces across Wales and the West of England and 11 fire and rescue services. And she's also the Senior Responsible Officer for the Criminal Justice and Joint Inspections portfolio, having previously been a Chief Crown Prosecutor with the Crown Prosecution Service, and before that, a solicitor. And Dr. Attry, as I say, is an associate of the Bonafero Institute of Human Rights and a fellow of Kellogg College here at Oxford. So Wendy, thank you very much for joining us, and perhaps you'd like to talk to us about the lessons learned.
Yes, thank you very much, Helen, for this invitation. What I'll do is I'll give some background information to the review. I'll talk about what happened and why in terms of the scandal, and then I'll come to what I did about it, so to speak. So in terms of background, in the summer of 2018, I was appointed by the then Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, to carry out a review into the Home Office's handling of the Windrush scandal. Now, I was asked to carry out an assessment of the policy, operational and legislative factors that led to members of the Windrush generation being caught up in enforcement measures designed for those who are here illegally. I was also asked what other factors played a part, why it wasn't spotted sooner, and what my recommendations are to hopefully avoid something similar happening again. And my report was presented to Parliament by the Home Secretary in March of this year. And then in June of this year, the Home Secretary announced that she accepted and would be implementing all 30 of my recommendations. And bringing matters right up to date, 2 weeks ago, the Home Secretary laid before the House the Home Office's formal response to my report and the 30 recommendations in the form of a comprehensive improvement plan. And that sets out their timescales and actions for completing my recommendations. So to what happened and why, my report starts with the story of Veronica and her father, Nathaniel. Nathaniel had come to the UK in the 50s, and he and Veronica went to Jamaica in 2001 for a holiday. Little did either of them know that Nathaniel would never see the UK again, because having lived in the UK since the 50s and having British status, unfortunately, his status wasn't recognised. And when he tried to return to the UK from his holiday, he wasn't allowed back into the country. And Veronica was forced to go back intermittently to Jamaica. She had a British passport and was able to do that, but she had to take career breaks to be able to do so because Nathaniel wasn't well. He had cancer, and ultimately and tragically, he died of prostate cancer. The irony of it was that he couldn't afford medical treatment in Jamaica, but as a person with British status, he was entitled to free medical attention and medical services in the UK, but those rights were lost to him. My report also talks about, I'll call him Mr. A. Now, Mr. A was a person who I met during the course of my review. He came to the UK from St. Lucia on his mother's passport as a little boy in the 60s. He came here, settled here, worked here, held a responsible job. But when in 2017, he wasn't able to prove his status, he lost his home, he lost his job, he lost his livelihood. And when I met him, he'd been estranged from his family and he was homeless. He was in tears. Now I'll come back to Mr. A in due course. And the third and final example I'll give is of Paulette Wilson, who also came to the UK in the 60s. Now, when she was unable to prove her status to the required standard, as a middle-aged grandmother, she was held in detention, she was locked up, and she was threatened with removal and return to her country of birth. And it was only because of the significant efforts that were made on her behalf by her family, by her legal representatives, and by her MP, and as a result of a publicity campaign, that she was eventually released. Now, tragically, Paulette Wilson died relatively recently, but the experiences of Nathaniel, Veronica, Mr. A, Paulette Wilson, and hundreds, if not thousands of others came to be known as the Windrush scandal. So why did the scandal happen? Well, the Windrush generation came to the UK from the Caribbean between 1948 and 1973, answering an invitation from the British government to come and help rebuild the country following the Second World War. They came here, they settled here, they made a significant contribution to the country, and as I've said, they became woven into the fabric of British society. They saw themselves as British, and indeed the 1971 Immigration Act makes that clear. But the difficulty was that they lacked the documents to prove it, and official records weren't kept. Many people did register their status, but some did not. And the reason why was that, as the report makes clear, the Home Office gave assurances that a failure to register would in no way affect either the rights or the status of the individuals who came from the Windrush generation. And my report actually sets out the written confirmation that was provided in response to questions asked at the time of the registration campaign, which confirmed just that. We also identified an internal Home Office document which confirmed that the Home Office at the time, quote unquote, didn't want to stimulate a flood of applications from individuals for registration at the time of the campaigns, because they were worried that they'd have insufficient resources to be able to cope with the demand. The Windrush generation acted on those assurances, the assurances, by the way, of one of the foremost departments of state, and sadly, those assurances proved to be hollow, because when successive governments in the 80s, 90s, and right the way through set out to prove that they were being tough on immigration, they introduced a set of immigration policies, the most notable of which was the hostile or compliant environment policy. And the aim of the policy was to cut off supply lines to services like bank accounts, access to healthcare, but also housing and jobs. The idea being that people who couldn't provide documents to prove their status were here illegally and would go voluntarily, they would leave the country voluntarily. But the point was that the Windrush generation had every right to be here. They had British status, they simply lacked the documents to prove it. And when members of the Windrush generation came to try to prove their status, as the compliant environment policies started to bite, this was decades after their arrival in the UK. And as I've said in my report, they were caught up in the hostile environment net. We've set out in the report an internal Home Office circular dated 2006, which actually said to its own staff that applicants from the Windrush generation who applied to regularise their status should be treated with discretion and sensitivity, because they were unlikely to be able to prove when they'd come to the country decades later, or that they'd been continuously resident for 40 or 50 years. But as I've said in my report, the Windrush generation were institutionally forgotten. They were asked to prove their status to an unreasonably high standard, and those who couldn't lost their homes, lost their jobs, lost their very sense of identity, and in extreme circumstances were locked up and removed and returned to their country of birth, in some instances a country that they hadn't seen for some 50 years. Now, as my report makes clear, there were both internal and external warning signs. Groups, individuals over the years flagged up the risk that the policy would trap the wrong people who had status but lacked the documents to prove it. Yet the department failed to listen, and the policy was followed relentlessly out of this unquestioning conviction that the policy was the right thing to do and that it would be effective. And as stories began to emerge, like that of Paulette Wilson's, the department was far too slow to act. And I mentioned Mr. A, as Mr. A said to me during the roadshow, "I can't believe I was treated like this by my beloved England." So on to my findings. My findings were that the Windrush scandal represented a profound institutional failure. Secondly, that the scandal was both foreseeable and avoidable. Thirdly, that the scandal was a long time in the making. Fourthly, that there were institutional, cultural, and political factors which caused a corrosive mix, unfortunately. But fourthly, I went on to say that the Home Office had demonstrated a culture of disbelief and a culture of carelessness. And I went on to say that the department demonstrated a culture of institutional thoughtlessness and ignorance on the history of the Windrush generation and the issue of race, and that these elements were consistent with some of the elements of the Macpherson definition of institutional racism, although I didn't reach a definitive finding in that regard. But I did make 30 recommendations which boiled down to 3 factors. Firstly, that the department should accept that what happened was wrong. It should acknowledge the wrong that occurred. Secondly, that it should open itself up to wider external scrutiny. And thirdly, that the department should change its culture and recognise that migration and indeed wider Home Office policy, whatever its objective, is about people and should be rooted in humanity. Now, Helen has mentioned recommendation 7, so I won't repeat it. What I will say is that when I set out, I could have concluded that the actions that the Home Office needed to take were, can I put it this way, fairly superficial. I could have, rooted my actions in process, but the more I looked into matters, the more I thought that the issues were far more deep-rooted than that. I set about learning about the history and the contribution of the Windrush generation, which I'm afraid to say I didn't know very much about. And the more that I learned, the more that it heightened the level of injustice. So in terms of my methodology, it included not only interviewing junior officials right through to the most senior officials, but it also involved me in interviewing politicians past and present. And as a result of those interviews, while some of the people that I interviewed were really reflective and had sought to identify some of the fundamental issues, others, I'm afraid, were what I've called in the report unimpressively unreflective, or they simply didn't have an understanding of Britain's history and also its history as it has affected the rest of the world, and the reasons why, given the historical context and given the history and contribution of the Windrush generation, this was such a profound institutional failure. So I therefore realised that there were significant shortcomings when it came to levels of awareness across the board in the department, which was the reason for my recommendation. But it went further than that. In addition to speaking to people who had been affected and members of the Home Office and politicians, I also spoke to a wide range of interested parties and stakeholders, some of whom said to me that it was their view that this was part of a wider issue, and they encouraged me to make a recommendation for wider government, and they were saying, look, this should be on the national curriculum, never mind just the Home Office. And so it struck me that many, if not most, of my recommendations were relevant not just to wider government, but also to wider society, which is why I'm delighted that firstly, there is a cross-government working group that's been set up, which I hope really does take forward the recommendations that I've made in my report, but bringing it to ultimate relevance, that's why I'm delighted to take part in this evening's discussion.
Wendy, thank you very much. I want to start asking all sorts of questions myself now, but I'm not going to do that. Partly I'm going to allow Shreya to make her contribution first, and also I'm going to do what I should have done at the beginning and forgot to do, which is to remind all of the participants this evening that you can ask questions in the Q&A function in Zoom throughout this seminar, and when Shreya has spoken and we've perhaps had a bit of to and fro here, then we will take some of your questions, so do please start to do that. So now can I introduce Dr. Shreya Attry. Shreya.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you for organizing this conversation. Thanks to both Manfield and to Bonavera. So thank you to Kate as well. Thank you, Gayatri, for organizing this fabulously. And thank you, Wendy, for that absolutely fantastic start and layout of what happened in Windrush. So my brief for today is to reflect on the question, as Helen said, how should educational institutions respond to the racial legacy of empire in the 21st century? Now, I'm following on from Wendy Williams, and I must recognize that there's really no way to follow that act. So I will not try to do that either. With all humility then, what I will try instead is to think aloud my own self-reflective practice on what I'm going to be calling today as simply decolonizing academia. This idea of decolonizing academia to me is about 4 things. It is, and in this order, first and foremost about research. It is then about teaching. These are the 2 principal things that we do as academics. But it is also about, thirdly, who we are, and last but not the least, about whom we teach, our students. Let me make an overarching remark about what is salient about this idea of decolonization, and then I will say precisely one thing about each of the 4 elements. I think of decolonization as an idea in academia more than anywhere else, in the processual mode, that it is one to be continuously and consistently done. And it just cannot be simply declared done. It is not a checkpost to go past or a goalpost to achieve. It is a process to commit to, and then in every day, in every way, make it part of our academic practice. But what do I mean when I say we have to do it rather than declare it done? Let's return to the first element of our work, which is research. I think race and the history of empire has to be closely researched, and in particular, collaboration with our academic peers in the global south and in universities in former colonies. This means bringing down the barriers of culture, language, economics, prestige that surrounds high-profile higher education institutions in the global north, in the UK specifically, and working with colleagues who have hitherto had little access to forms of knowledge creation. So lest you think this is simply about reading and referring to works of colleagues based in former colonies, let me clarify that I'm making a more structural point here, that large, influential higher education institutions such as Oxford will have to actively work towards diluting their own hegemony and significance through structural reform such as funding or access to funding, or how the publication system works in terms of who is published, who is referred to, and the systems in which this referencing works. Second, among the many ways in which I think teaching can be decolonized, I want to point out just one. I think teaching, especially students who are non-white, BAME, or even more broadly, international students, teaching has to be less extractive, especially in social sciences. I think non-white and international students cannot be looked at as providing the necessary diverse background to an otherwise essentialist mode of teaching and operating. And we cannot look to our BAME students for different or exciting examples. Even if it is in their interest to share their experiences, it is not their burden to make themselves the examples through which others learn. That to me is not how we do anti-racist work at all. And that to me is significant in recognizing the power dynamics between us, with me as the teacher and my BAME and international students who are not here to serve my teaching or my interests or the interests of the class as a whole, but to perhaps reconfigure a non-hierarchical environment where learning is flowing in all directions. Third, who am I in this whole idea of decolonizing academia? Now, I don't want to pontificate on this existentialist question, but I wish to address one dilemma about who we are as academics when we're trying to do race work and trying to undo the legacy of the empire in powerful universities, especially. So this dilemma to me is best summed up as #CheckYourPrivilege, which is essentially about someone telling us to get a grip about doing work that is essentially about extreme forms of disprivilege from an extremely privileged position. I think #CheckYourPrivilege is such a significant one in reminding us of our own positionality and then committing to constantly keeping that in reference when we work with dispossessed communities or on thorny issues of race, class, gender, and all kinds of intersectional issues, when we have, if not eliminated, at least avoided those issues for ourselves. And that is why we are here in this extremely privileged and frankly lucky position at all. But here's the important point. Once I have committed to this process, I will not be thwarted by it, because checking privilege is not about checking out of the work of decolonization. Privilege should not paralyze us, but it should make us more reflective and nuanced about this, about our relationship with the world and the work we do about the world at universities. Finally, who are you, our students? I think anti-racist work and work involving undoing the legacy of empire in 21st century is about nurturing students who have been disadvantaged by or excluded by race, class, ethnicity, regionality, nationality, and so on. It is, of course, about better access to future applicants from disprivileged communities, more scholarships, better resources, and so on. But it is, to me, primarily a pastoral commitment to work with those here and now to find a place for themselves so they can belong here. Belong to the elite university, which seems so distant to them and to their experiences, as it did to me as a student here, and as perhaps it always will feel a bit distant. Belongingness, though, to a place that carries the historical legacy of colonization and imperialism, and perhaps neo-imperialism and forms of contemporary colonization, it's hard. Belongingness to such a place is hard. But that is exactly what I want to cultivate with you, my students. For you to feel like you're at home. So thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing perhaps more from Helen, whom I know who's thought deeply about decolonizing academia, especially in her role as the principal. And I look forward to hearing more about Wendy, about how she feels we at higher education institutions should contribute to the goal. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Wendy and Shreya, for those thoughtful observations. Wendy, I wonder if, and do I remind you all participants, do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A function, and I'll put them, because otherwise I will hog it all, and that would be unfair. Wendy, I wonder, in response to some of the things that Shreya was saying, why it is you think that the cultural issues that arose in the Home Office the lack of awareness of the history of empire, and indeed, as you said, your own lack of awareness as an educated Black woman of the contribution of the Windrush generation. And I just, in case that sounded critical, I must say that I read David Olusoka's book, Black and British, over the summer, and I was frankly ashamed that as a history graduate and somebody who spent 30 years working in race discrimination law, there was so much that I didn't know. I really did feel bad about that. And I just wonder what we can do through our whole educational system, but perhaps in universities in particular, to address that.
Well, I think it's actually worse than that in my case, Helen, because I'm not just a black woman. I am a black woman of Caribbean extraction. So my goodness me, if it's not poor in my case, I don't know where else it is. And that was the point. My own level of awareness was founded on the information that I'd been given from my family and from my network. So I understood the experiences of those within my family and wider network. But as to the wider contribution of the Windrush cohort, I didn't have that information. And when I was going to school, the information that was taught, you know, in terms of the history curriculum, concentrated on things like Tudor history, which I really enjoyed actually, but also, you know, it concentrated on the kings and queens and British history in isolation, not British history as it affected other parts of the world. So the contribution of my ancestors wasn't really tackled. Then if we fast forward to the review itself, I had to go back to school. So I spoke to a number of academics and gained that information. And I spent a wonderful afternoon in the company of the curator of the RAF Museum, for example, and he took me through, you know, the contribution that the Windrush generation had made to the war effort, never mind the post-war effort. And he told me about people like Cy Grant, and he sent me all these books and said, look, you've really got to read these. And I did. And the great thing was that by immersing myself in that information, I was able to see what the contribution of the generation had been. And as I say, it heightened the sense of injustice in terms of what occurred. Then when I was carrying out the review itself, in addition to looking at nearly 70,000 documents, reading all 164 of the relevant cases of people who'd been affected, but also interviewing politicians past and present and both senior and junior officials, a couple of things struck me. One was that as a black female, it was highly unusual, I think, for the people who were being interviewed, particularly the senior officials and politicians, to be asked questions about race and the history of the Windrush generation by me. So that was an interesting dynamic in itself. But also the information that I got back, I'm afraid, as I say, in some instances was pretty impressive, but in more instances was not. And when one considers that certainly the senior ranks of the Home Office, and this is probably the case when one looks not only at central government, but also at larger institutions, at senior levels, there aren't the numbers of people who look like me amongst those ranks. So if you are drawing from a very narrow range of individuals in terms of social background, in terms of ethnic background, then the likelihood is that their experiences will not be either empathetic or indeed in any way consistent with those whom they serve. This becomes of particular importance when one looks at the Home Office, because it is dealing with public protection, it's dealing with migration, it's dealing with some of these really important issues. And it should know, the officials within the Home Office, they should be the experts, they should be on top of the brief. But I end by saying it comes back to my view, which is if we are educated according to this very narrow curriculum, which doesn't incorporate and encompass wider experiences and doesn't fully plot Britain's position in colonial history and in the history of the world, then I think we're all labouring under a real disadvantage.
Yeah. Thank you. Shreya, I wonder what you think about that. It made me, when Wendy was talking, it made me reflect on the way the school curriculum works in Britain, where you learn a lot of Tudors and 6 wives and all that stuff. Then you kind of jump. Oh, then you do the English Civil War, and then you kind of jump over to Factory Acts and abolishing slavery for everyone else who still had it, and social reform, and into the and into defeating fascism. And there's a complete convenient jump over the 18th century, which is really the kind of most shameful period of British history, and one that I don't think is taught very, very much at all. And I wonder if subconsciously that's something that's gone on. But I wonder, Shreya, what your thoughts are on that, particularly as an Indian woman in Oxford.
Thank you, Helen. I think this has received wisdom on this in the subcontinent, but perhaps the sense that during that part of history, colonization wasn't happening here. It just wasn't the case where it was this land where it was happening. So you can learn from Holocaust if you're German, because it's the place where it's happening. And the coincidence there that makes it possible for the learning to have happened. It just didn't happen here, and hence it didn't happen. And hence the revisionist history of, oh, this was a good thing, because it's being written by those who weren't exactly based and who weren't the ones who were experiencing it. That revisionist history sort of takes place instead. So you've created an entire narrative which is the anti-narrative of what was actually happening, and actually an anti-narrative of what actually exists as the received wisdom in the subcontinent. I can just speak to the subcontinent. I think similar patterns of history would exist in other colonies as well. But the coincidence of regionality there that made I suppose all the difference. And I think this is shared with, say, what happened with King Leopold and Congo and books like Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Coast, which is a journalistic book, just brings that out so deeply that just because it was elsewhere, colonization just doesn't get the reading of history that it should. And perhaps, and this is the optimistic way to see Windrush and Wendy's excellent report. It's happened here. This is a Home Office issue, and this is a British issue. And for finally, you come to a point where you feel that this has happened here on this land, and that's when the real reckoning can start to happen. And you almost feel that this was necessary to have gone through, because unless effects of coloniality are felt here and now, I don't think we'll continue to do anything about learning more about racism and the history of colonial legacy in this country. So thank you, Wendy, for responding from within the country to the relationship with Caribbean and what happened in Windrush, because it has finally become the British problem to think about.
Wendy, I've got 2 questions which will tie up with one another. One is a question to both of you, which Shreya actually started to answer with one reference, but are there any books that you particularly recommend for those who wish to educate themselves on these matters? And I would say obviously start with the Windrush Review by Wendy Williams, essential reading, and Intersectionality by Shreya Attry. But after that, is there anything else you'd particularly recommend? And also a question from a geography student who's currently writing an undergraduate dissertation about how the British Empire is represented in educational resources at British School Key Stage 3, and the imaginative geographies that are reproduced in textbooks and videos like BBC Bite Size, and answering that the only curriculum that suggests studying the British Empire as the history curriculum, and then even that's not a statutory requirement. So how do you think the whole school curriculum could be broadened so to include alternative histories and geographies of the British Empire to raise all of our awareness?
Well, if I start, Helen, thank you for preempting what I was about to say, which is, you know, my report and everything that goes with it. And but seriously, the reason for that is that because I did do, and the team who were fantastic did do so much research, there are so many documents that are referenced there, and the work of so many academics and authors are also referenced there. So please do refer to them. And it's all footnoted. There are links and so on that attach to the digital version of the report. You mentioned David Olusoga's book, which I have found extremely illuminating, and so I would add to that. So that's what I'd say in terms of literature, but I'm by no means the authority. I mean, there are so many others to whom we could refer. As to the second question about what can be done, that's why I'm hopeful about the cross-government working group, because if one can look at national curriculum and can identify those elements that should form part of the compulsory, the mandatory element of consideration of pupils in schools, then I think that's a powerful and essential starting point, because from there, other institutions can build on that curriculum. But at the moment, as your questioner has pointed out, there just isn't that mandatory requirement. And so there's very little, if anything, at the moment, and there needs to be much more.
Shreya.
Thank you, Helen. Readings. So I mentioned the idea of belongingness, and that comes from Neera Yuval Davis's work. And everything she writes about this idea of belongingness, and especially the idea of British identity as being very peculiar in comparison to how other people and other theorists think about citizenship, is very interesting. So it's interesting that she thinks that it's almost that you're imagining citizenship through the idea of belongingness, which is already multicultural in nature. So you're imagining a British society which is internally diverse. So normally you imagine political communities as citizenship, as political communities and belonging to them, as like a coherent idea of the state and the nationality of the state, and you belong to this one universal essentialist idea. But the British identity is unique in the sense that it has the multicultural component sort of at its heart, theoretically, normatively, in hope, optimistically. But if that's the idea, then how is it that you create this identity from within? And Mr. A's view, which Wendy just mentioned about, you know, it's my England which has betrayed me. It's very much evocative of exactly that idea of what belongingness to Britain means, because it provides you this sense of coming from everywhere and yet having to belong. And Windrush has sort of chipped away at that. But it's beautiful work. It's Neera Yuval Davis's exploration. She writes on intersectionality and ideas of citizenship and British identity. Check her out. I do want to mention a non-academic work as well, which I've recently really liked, which is also about belongingness. So this is Nikesh Shukla, and this is actually a crowd-funded book. It's an edited collection called The Good Immigrant, and it weaves in ideas of how people view immigrants and what is the good immigrant. And the good immigrant is one who doesn't cook curry at home, so everything smells of curry, and he's a good tenant. A good immigrant is who embraces saying namaste to everything. And there's these nice essays which sort of grapple at how we otherize people in accepting them and integrating them. We almost sort of make them caricatures of themselves in the process of having them belong to a certain place. So belongingness ends up being people being typified or stereotyped in certain categories. But it's a nice exploration. They're very quick, snappy essays, and helps us think in more contemporary ways and in a light way about our own everyday practice and how we relate to people from different backgrounds and cultures and language and everything. To the geography student who asked that question, it's fascinating. I genuinely find it hard myself to think about school curriculum, but I can respond to it from the perspective of higher education institutions, where one of the things we have to continuously think about is, why should we decolonize and work on race if I don't work on history, right? Clearly history is the site to decolonize, and rest of us can sit back and go on doing the work that we do. Unfortunately, I think the epistemological work, which has to do with knowledge around race and racism, and the history of it, has to be done by historians. That's right. But I think if we understand conceptually what race and racism is, we will understand that it has not everything to do with what happened and transpired in the past, but it's a way of understanding present and how systems of privilege and disprivilege are created today. So say, if you work in sciences, how funding in sciences is regulated in and around very powerful institutes, academies of sciences, and how that funding does not get funneled into universities, perhaps in the global south, is a problem of colonization when resources were taken from the global south to the global north, right? So we're thinking about how these patterns have been created which don't allow research in science to be done. And that's the problem of colonization. And I think it's to learn a bit more about how the inequity in the world has been created. That's learning more about. So I can't imagine which discipline can't do this work, in fact. And learning a bit more about structures of privilege within our disciplines, no matter where we're located, even in sciences, is perhaps our mandate here, so to say, for academics in higher education institutions at least.
And I do recommend the work of Angela Saini, who is a speaker in one of the previous talks that we had at Mansfield, which is absolutely fascinating from that science point of view, about the way that scientists need to think about the prejudices and the assumptions they bring to their work, the same as anybody else does. I'm really tempted to go on with this bit of the conversation and join in, but I'm not going to, because there are lots and lots of questions which have come in. For those of you who are associated with Mansfield, we thought about these questions earlier this year, actually as a result of questions raised by Black students and Black students representatives, and we had a sort of a round college consultation on this, and have broadened the resources in our library in every subject area, so theology, geography, literature, other areas, as well as history. And I do recommend to check out that library, and anyone else, I'm very happy to share the catalogue with anybody. But I'm having some questions here. I think I can summarize it. It's Richard Coggins, who's one of our politics and international relations lecturers here, who's, I think, perhaps thinking that we are the choir here on a Friday night, or singing to each other joyfully, and it's all very well, but may we be on the losing side of this debate? What about Michael Gove? And I recall David Cameron saying it was his favourite book, Our Island Story, and that version of history where Britain succeeded until it took over the world in a glorious way and made everything good. And indeed, our current Prime Minister, who's on the record as having said not that the tragedy is not that we were in Africa, but that we're not still there. So how can we try to decolonize thought and the curriculum from inside government? And perhaps associated with this, a question for Wendy Williams: to what extent do you think that the Windrush scandal was not just about ignorance and passivity, but active racist motivation within the Home Office?
Well, in terms of how we decolonise, Helen, my view is that the debate has been started. The Pandora's box has been opened. There have been some tragic events that have led to a broader discussion. And this is the first time, certainly in my career, that I'm aware of having these sorts of conversations. In having carried out the review, it has sort of opened my eyes in many ways, but it's also made me want to be brave, by which I mean, before, if you had asked me about questions of race, history, colonial history, etc., I would have probably shied away and been very reluctant to talk about it, almost, yes, I am a black woman. But the great thing is that having done this review and having seen the importance to society, I hope that doesn't sound too grand, of the error and the profound error that occurred, and the need to avoid, hopefully, something similar happening, we have to have that debate. So in answer to the first question, I think we're talking. Now the important thing is to translate that discussion so that it doesn't turn into ambient noise, but it actually materialises into formal action, which takes me on to the second question. As part of the review, and I make this point in the report, there were some officials within the Home Office whose view was, well, you didn't find evidence of overt racism, you didn't find evidence of negative stereotyping, you didn't find anything of that nature. And so in the absence of that, there isn't a problem. My point was, you're absolutely right, I could not point to examples of direct, overt and offensive racism. But the question is the extent to which the other factors, so I talk about indicators of indirect discrimination, I talk about some elements of the Macpherson definition that I saw present, which gave rise and give rise to the risk that it is there, but it's just, in a different form, and it's latent, and, I was unlikely to find an internal circular that said something really dreadful. So even though it didn't present in an overt way, I say the risk is there, the indicators were there, and that the department should at least work to assure itself of the absence of bias. I would never, make an allegation that I couldn't substantiate, and my report, I think, is testament to that. But the department has to have that, I've said, professional curiosity and that rigour to assure itself of the absence of bias.
I think it's very interesting what you've said about that, and the conversations about education and what we need to know, which are arising from your report. And I do think it's a historic moment, and perhaps the kind of self-examination that, because we haven't had a moment of denazification, or we haven't had the end of apartheid moment that led to some of these conversations in South Africa, that perhaps that's where some of these things come from. But I do want to contribute at this point, because I think it's material to this link between what we learn and what we think about and how we change structures. That in 2005, I was involved in the first case on the public sector equality duty. And the public sector equality duty is the duty that was introduced after the death of Stephen Lawrence, who was a black teenager and murdered in South London. And after that, there was a report where Sir William Macpherson said that there had been insufficient thought about the way that the police was operating, the assumptions they brought to dealing with the parents who were the parents of a victim of crime and investigating that crime, and that there needed to be more analysis. And so the government introduced a legal duty to think about what was needed to do to avoid unlawful discrimination and to advance equality and good relations. And the first case was brought by somebody pre-Windrush generation, actually, who is she was a British citizen, but she was born in Hong Kong. She was brought up in Hong Kong. She was actually an Iraqi Jew by origin, but she was brought up in Hong Kong. And when the war happened, she was imprisoned by the Japanese in Hong Kong as a British citizen. That was why she was imprisoned. And most of the people who the British thought of as British, the women and children who were white, had been got out of Hong Kong before the Japanese came. But that's why the Japanese imprisoned her. She suffered untold horrors in this prisoner of war camp, from which she suffered post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of her life. But after that, she came to Britain. She married here, she had a family here, she paid taxes here, had businesses here. And then the government decided in the 1990s to introduce a reparation for people who had been prisoners of war of the Japanese of £10,000 for British prisoners of war of the Japanese. And only after they had announced it, said that that wouldn't include people where either they or their parents or grandparents were born in Britain. So although she was imprisoned by the Japanese because she was British, and she was a British citizen, she paid taxes here her whole adult life from 1945. She wasn't British enough to get the reparation from the British government. And she was absolutely convinced this was indirect race discrimination, which indeed it was. But it took her a very long fight. And it sort of established this concept. And it really does seem to me that first we need the stories, and we need to understand the assumptions about who is truly British behind our laws and rules, and then we see why the rules apply to people and create problems. And I think it's really very difficult. And so I suppose arising from that, I wanted to ask you both to answer a question which has arisen about how we can best ensure that government doesn't just pay lip service to the recommendations in your review, Wendy, and how we can learn the lessons of the Windrush scandal and apply them for the future so that we don't repeat some of the assumptions that have been there. So I don't know which one of you wants to start.
Shall I go first in terms of ensuring that my recommendations are implemented? I have been invited back by the Home Office in a year's time to review progress. And so that offer, I think, is a positive indicator. I did say that the messaging that I've heard from the department to its staff has been positive, and there have been lots of discussions. At the time of the publication of my report, I urged the department to take time to pause and reflect on the true implications for the department and its 35,000 staff before diving into process and solution mode. And I certainly saw evidence that that was the case. There were lots of staff events, lots of, have your say events over the months, and they are encouraging to me. So I'm certainly hopeful that the department will embark on this programme and really use it as an opportunity to demonstrate that step change in its culture and its workings. In addition to my return in a year's time, in their comprehensive improvement plan, which the department lodged a couple of weeks ago, they have said that there are various mechanisms that they will be putting in place to assess progress. And so hopefully the combination of the department's own activities coupled with their very kind invitation for me to return will result in the department not paying lip service to my report.
And just before I go to Shreya, Wendy, do you think, because some people predict there were going to be a lot more undocumented migrants here as the result of Brexit, because people came perfectly lawfully, they didn't document what they were doing when they got here. And in terms of devising a response to that, do you think there are factors that will be drawn out of your report that ought to influence how they think about that? Will that be part of your return in a year's time, when presumably we will definitely have completely left Europe?
I think, sorry, that was my phone. I think that as far as the settlement scheme is concerned, it isn't something that I have specific information about, but there are certain indicators here. And so in terms of the things that went wrong with Windrush, I really do hope that aspects such as having an effective outreach programme, awareness raising programme, encouraging people to apply to regularise their status, being alive to vulnerability, being alive to communities that might not be easy to reach, and setting itself the targets to ensure that, because they've, as I understand it, there are projections in terms of the sorts of numbers that might be affected. So working really hard to address any gaps and to address that shortfall. If the department does follow certainly my recommendations about the formulation of policy, the implementation of policy and the review of policy to ensure that it's successful, then hopefully the EU settlement scheme won't result in a rerun of Windrush.
Yeah. And Shreya, when you answer, I wonder if you can take in, because an important question that's come up really from us from an internal university point of view about how we change structures, asking whether what's happening about training faculty and staff on the impact of perhaps tokenism and the impact of the educational outcome gap for people of British and other minority ethnic backgrounds in British higher education and the curriculum, and how we can work to make students of colour feel that they belong and that their stories are important on university campuses without waiting another 100 years, someone else has put it.
Oh, Helen, you may be better placed to answer this question from a structural point of view with the university. I mean, from an Oxford perspective, I mean, it's so interesting, but not obvious as to how decentralized the university is and how autonomous and independent most of us are in terms of how our academic practice is organized. It's almost bizarre to express it to someone who would think like, oh, but surely you're part of this big, very influential university. But the level of autonomy at which we operate, I think, allows for both very deep, self-reflective, anti-racist policy and practice to develop personally. But it also allows for people slipping through the cracks of having to do things in the spirit of decolonization. So how do we build systems while retaining the nice autonomous parts of a university like Oxford, where you don't want to be too heavy-handed, especially with academics, especially people who appreciate independent research, right? That we thrive in the role that we do because our research and teaching is independent, that we have the space to think and do and say things freely. Right? How do we balance that? Trainings are complex, and I just want to mention a cautionary note about a complex design of training programs on race and any other personal characteristic, in fact. There are studies which I think are useful for us to refer to in relation to sexual harassment, where trainings are huge, and they've been studied to not have the kind of impact they're meant to have in really changing institutional cultures. And if we think institutional culture is the problem, then training somehow become part of how the institution is run, and institutions change the training and how race is to be done by providing this very straitjacket technical program of just people having to tick mark and getting done with, look, we have told people about race and that's how it's done. So I would be very wary of technocratic systems where people are just thrown into an orientation room and told, right in the beginning of the academic year, now go learn about race and do this right for the rest of the year. I think self-reflection happens when there's a push from students from the outside. And I think so much of what has happened right has been because people have been out on the streets, they've been out at seminars, and they've been asking for things. So I think social movements are crucial. And I think academics within universities are responsive to it. If we imagine the Roads Must Fall as something which is very much a university-born movement, change at universities, whether it's Cape Town or Oxford, is happening through that. And I think it's not often thinking about large institutional processes, because remember, institutions are very, very powerful. And they tend to change the language of decolonial, anti-racist work on the empire more than you think they can. So I think pressure from our customers, which is students, and I don't like to think of it in terms of a service economy, but really it is public service to be doing teaching and to be doing research, even though we're private universities. If we conceptualize it as this reflective conversation and responding to the pressures which are outside, especially social movements, which are university-born movements, I think we have some hope of making progress.
Shreya, it's interesting when you said I could say something more about this. My immediate thought was, but I am not part of the departmental university. So exactly as you say, we're terribly decentralized. But I do think that what you're saying about conversations is so important, and the power of students to push, but then I think the duty of the rest of us to examine and to ask questions, not to have a particular, so, you know, the procedure is and the stuff you must learn is, but to think. And that's why I think the model of the public sector ecology duty is so important, because we're thinking about, if you're going to eliminate discrimination and advance equality of opportunity, you can't do that unless you ask the questions, which are, what are the barriers? And then that's the moment when you start to ask questions, you're self-reflective and you empathize. I think it's very important that Wendy said, I knew so little. You know, it's not because you're an evil racist that you don't know things, it's because you haven't asked the right questions. And that's why asking the questions is so important. And the recommendations I think that Wendy's made in her report are so important. I would really like to go on all night. I can't go on all night, but I'm just going to leave it with one final question to both of you. Somebody has asked how optimistic you are that the right lessons of the Windrush scandal will be learned and applied. So Wendy, how optimistic are you?
In answer to this question, Helen, I always say I'm hopeful. I don't know how optimistic I can be. I don't want to be pessimistic, I really don't, because if the Home Office responds as positively as certainly they've indicated they are ready to do, nobody will be more pleased than I, because what that will mean is that the service received by the communities that the Home Office serves, they will be so much the better for it, and the department itself will be so much improved. So I am hopeful, and I mean, I have said this is a seminal moment for the department. They've got this opportunity. I really hope that they take it.
Shreya?
How optimistic am I? Yeah, you know, I work on intersectional feminism, specifically Black feminist theory and Dalit feminist theory, and it's always an interesting strain of that work as to why are people theorizing from very, very unoptimistic, unhopeful positions, being hopeful that these conversations, constitutional rights, human rights, governmental procedures, inquiries, how are they hopeful that any of this is going to work? And I think they have a simple answer to this, which I'll give as well. When you come from a position where you have nothing to lose, all you have is hope. So you have a lot of hope. And if that's all that you have to work with, you think of transformative utopias. And where do you get the energy to do that? Well, somehow you find the energy to imagine the opposite of what you're currently existing in. The hope comes from that. So the breeding ground is people's own appreciation of what they don't have, and their own appreciation of inequality and discrimination. And I think so long as people are acutely aware of it and what injustice means, they'll always come up with an antidote, imaginations, utopias which look different. So it's not necessarily that hope comes from something good to have happened. Actually, hope comes from simply the opposite, that there isn't any hope. So sorry to be circular, but there is hope, because people who are dispossessed continue to fight, and to give the rest of us hope to join their fights.
Yeah. As one of my theology fellows said to me yesterday, hope is a breath in a dry throat. And since we have no option other than hope, other than despair, which would be terrible, hope is, I think, where we have to go. It's wonderful that we can meet, have so many people here because of being online. The great sadness for me is that I can't continue this conversation with you both over dinner. I hope I will be able to do that before too long. But thank you very, very much for such a stimulating and hope inspiring conversation. I really do feel very honoured to have been part of it, and thank you all for joining. Do check out on the Mansfield College webpage the rest of the talks we have for the rest of this term on Fridays, although not next Friday, but they include people talking about climate change, and Baroness Hale talking about her career, and our alumnus Rishi Daster talking about creativity in the 21st century. So I hope some food for thought and hope. But for now, Wendy and Shreya and Kate and the Bonavero team, thank you all very, very much for a fantastic evening's conversation. And thank you all for joining us.